Hello.
Hi Rosie, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Does anyone else need to come in apart from Dan Burr?
No, it's just Dan and I.
Yeah, cool.
Hi there.
Hi, how are you doing?
All right, yeah.
I've literally just finished the one from before. I went.
Oh, you're bouncing from one to the next.
So it's recording already. Actually, I might stop it from recording.
Why are you doing that?
There we go. Oh, when you talk, you come up.
All right. Well, hi everyone. My name's Dan Burr. I'm a partner with Sheppard Robson Architects in London. And Rosie, do you want to say hello? And I'll give a bit of intro about us.
Yeah. So my name's Rosie, and I was the editor of this publication. So we worked on this together alongside other collaborators within our organization and many people throughout the built environment.
Just to introduce ourselves, Sheppard Robson, we're one of the larger practices in the UK. We're based in London, Manchester and Glasgow. And well, actually at the moment we're based in about 270 different offices across the UK, most of them in North London, where our main office is in Camden. Our practice is quite unique in the country, that we've been in existence for 80 years. I've not been working there for all of those, but we're quite unique in that regard, and we're on our 5th generation of partners. There's not many other practices that have been around that long. This publication has come out around the sort of process of reflection we had ourselves, having gone across our 80th anniversary as a practice in the last year or so. And we thought it was time to sort of take stock of not only where we've been as a practice, where we've come from over those 80 years. Practice grew up in the sort of the post-war boom. It was founded just before the Second World War, but really grew after that, and asked ourselves some fairly searching questions about where the future of the practice was going, and where the future of the role of the architect, how much has changed since the practice was founded all those years ago, and how we're likely to have to adapt, and crucially, how can architects really be a valuable value to society going forward. Rather than just sitting around amongst ourselves and talking about that, we had a couple of sort of round table discussions in the office, and we invited other architects and some developers and people from GLA in London, from local authority, and planners, and asked ourselves those questions. So it wasn't really just about us. We were sort of throwing out the discussion about what do architects need to think about going forward. And whilst I think good architects are good listeners, and we like to think of ourselves as good listeners, that's not always the case. Are we really as attuned to the needs of others, or the actual users of our building, as we should be? And in some ways, I think in modern practice, you're quite often not designing buildings. Your engagement with the people who actually use them is always at one step removed, because you're dealing with a different client body. And how can we be more agile and receptive to taking on board a broader and more diverse set of opinions? And Rory L. Cato, who's a well-known writer, was part of that discussion, and he sort of said, architecture feels like a club. It's a bit of an in crowd, and it needs to be more like a profession. And is architects and our architects and the built environments really reaching out into society and answering the real questions, or are we just quite often designing for an audience of architects? And I think that was quite a fairly sort of piercing criticism, is that it's true in a lot of cases. And so following on from that discussion and thinking about that, we hit upon this term co-creation, as being one of the vehicles as the way that we can maybe think about how we move forward as a profession and us as a practice to overcome some of the barriers to this sort of breakdown in communication between ourselves, the built environment professional, and maybe the users of buildings that we design. So the publication we're going to talk to you today is around that theme, and we're trying to sort of unpack what it really means to co-create and how we can push the idea of engagement much further. And the idea of co-creation actually is, as architects or people designing buildings or in the built environment professions, there already is some semblance of a dialogue. The term co-creation has been bandied around quite a lot in kind of consumer businesses, where people who might make a product, put it on the market, hope it sells. If it sells well, that's great. If it doesn't, they discontinue it. But there's not much dialogue between the consumer and the producer. And so big firms like Lego have started to move in this direction, where they're trying to establish, using social media, modern methods of communication, to try and establish more of a dialogue with their market, with their consumers, and try and close that loop and deliver more of what people want, or allow people to contribute ideas. So it's been sort of co-opted by kind of manufacturing, I think, but we were sort of thinking whether that idea could be re-energized in the domain of design, and try and come up with the ways with which people could have a better dialogue, a richer dialogue. And I think what it comes down to in the end is trying to build a more detailed and a richer brief for the buildings that we then go on to design.
Yeah, and so because this has been adapted from really product design, there is a little bit of confusion, I think, in architecture and the built environment on how co-creation is distinct from co-design or consultation, collaboration. There's a lot of co-words thrown around. So to begin with, we spoke with leading co-creation academic. So this is Lady Rachel Cooper. And she really discussed with us the principles and the practicalities of co-creation, exploring the role of the architect really as a sort of facilitator between vision and delivery of a project, and also between the design team and its end users. So Rachel really defines co-creation as distinct from collaboration or co-design, as it's a really structured and constant process. So co-creation is an open process where everyone, so stakeholders, users, project team, they work together to establish the direction of a project. But this is not design by committee. This isn't the whole community designing. But this input then goes into the work that a specialist design team does. And then they collaborate together, and that part is the co-design. So Rachel also talks about how architects, they can sometimes be wary of engagement, and especially more engagement, because there's maybe a sort of fear that this will erode the responsibility of the architect, and it will end up as designed by committee. But this doesn't really happen in a clear co-creation process. If it's structured well, really co-creation gives architects a higher status and more responsibility as really the conductor of this process. So really, co-creation presents an opportunity for architects to be a more central figure to this process that is balancing physical requirements with human experience. So co-creation in architecture and in design more generally, urban design, it really asks more from our spaces. How can we empower young people to have a more prominent role in shaping our cities? Or how can co-creation engage with global issues such as climate change? We feel that the answers to these questions can be solved really by adopting the openness and the breadth of thinking that co-creation really encourages. So through heightened engagement, we can create designs that really more effectively serve end users, organizations, and communities, and co-creation is key to this. So the publication that we created was based off of this idea. It's a real collaboration between many organizations, many individuals to really unpack the idea of what co-creation means for the built environment. These are just some of the people that contributed to the publication. It features many voices, architects, developers, community leaders, all sorts of people that really contributed to this to have a breadth of opinion. So the publication is organized around a set of themes that emerged from this study. And we drew them out over the last sort of year. They all build off of each other, and each of these pieces are really necessary to make co-creation work. And we had some commentary and case studies for each of these themes. I also think it's not a coincidence that many of these themes are also the themes of York Design Week. I think it's a testament to the fact that, designers across the board are increasingly interested in pushing design, whether for architecture, for the built environment, or otherwise, to be both a source and a catalyst for advocacy to really create a better future, which is what this publication is really about at its heart. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the chapters and the publication, and then we'll go into more detail on a couple of the themes. So here, building off of Rachel Cooper's ideas, that place listening as really the fundamental first step in co-creation. So successful co-creation is predicated on openness, dialogue, and really making the space to hear the unexpected. So while Rachel Cooper offers a more theoretical understanding of co-creation, an example where some of these principles were actually applied and applied successfully were given by Sheppard Robson's Charles Scott, and he reflected on basically our work in sub-Saharan African cities with water aid. And there, the huge scale, complexity, and significance of the projects really required co-creation for their engagement. And that allowed the designers to be attuned to the many different voices and stakeholders in the communities that they were affecting. The piece specifically looks at a project in Lagos, and it highlights the challenge of honoring unexpected insights that can arise during an open engagement process through co-creation. And architects really need to be able to balance this information with a broad and holistic understanding of the project brief to design solutions that both address immediate need and long-term vision. So one of the things that we wanted to do with the publication was to not paint co-creation as this really sort of easy, clean, straightforward process. There needs to be an acknowledgement that it's going to be messy and it's going to be complicated. It requires openness, and it requires being prepared for some conflict. Because when you end up speaking to a lot of people, listening to different end users, they're all going to have differing aspirations for the communities. You need to be attuned to all of those voices. So this leads into our next chapter, which builds off of this idea of listening, and it really focuses on trust as a very, very fundamental principle that's needed to make co-creation work. So this chapter acknowledges that regeneration is often regarded as almost a toxic word for communities, where it's felt as if development has been done to them rather than with them. And it explores how to rebuild this dynamic of trust between communities and the built environment. So Dan is going to come back to this in a minute in more detail. We also wanted to look at how architects and how the built environment professionals communicate their ideas and their projects. So we can be a bit prosaic about engaging with the wider world through our communication in architecture. We rely really heavily on CGIs and marketing language, a lot of jargon really. And this sort of communicates not only a veneer of what projects are about, but it's not really the most understandable for the average person. And so this chapter proposes some alternatives on how to expand how we communicate our ideas with people. So this article, the first one included, is by former AJ editor Rory Aljeto that Dan mentioned before. And his essay looks at really the use of fiction and narratives as alternatives to a standard, say, like a design and access statement, which is actually really quite unapproachable for most people, but different means of communication that are more engaging to the average person can sometimes better portray your ideas. We also have a piece from Alan Bainbridge at the BBC, and he writes about his need or the need to work harder to see the world through other people's eyes. He talks about how at BBC Wales, they used VR headsets actually, and this allowed the design team to understand how people experience space, and it particularly focused on those who are neurodivergent. And his piece really ends in asking, what is the wider application of a heightened level of empathy, and how can co-creation facilitate that and create better design places? We also have a bit of a departure from the written pieces. We have a photo essay. So this is by photographer Roman Kester, and it moves away from very perfect, formal architectural images of buildings to really foreground people and uses and really the life that transpires within the built environment. So Roman captured some of the life occurring at a couple of our projects, and this one was quite interesting. It was at 245 Hammersmith in London, and there was actually a photography class that was walking around, and they used a piazza as an impromptu photo background. So the previous chapters, which were listening, trusting, and communicating, they're really understood as the fundamentals that enable people and communities to feel empowered to participate in this co-creation process. So this chapter really focuses on examples where co-creation has been really successfully applied. And as a result, there's been sort of a collective sense of ownership over the finished project. And this really ultimately creates a more effective place that better addresses people's needs. So I'm going to talk later in more detail about this example, which is Contact Theatre in Manchester. But the other project that we feature here is a community garden. It's called Friendsbury Gardens in South London, where the community was really involved in the making process. And again, it cultivated this really rich sense of community ownership over the project. I also want to highlight that the projects that are mentioned throughout the publication and the ideas and how they're applied, they really span a range of project scales. So it's from small community gardens to larger urban regeneration projects. So even though they're very different projects, these concepts can be tailored to fit the needs of different projects at different scales. And in our final chapter, we really wanted to highlight as well that co-creation isn't just about architects listening, but it's also a key way to use their expertise to advocate for values that will shape the future of the built environment. So here, we spoke with Sarah Carey, who is the Executive Director of Place at Enfield Council. And we talked about engaging communities in climate change and advocating for sustainable principles through co-creation.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the sort of central chapter, which is trust, which is kind of the keystone to what we've been talking about, and how we can establish trust. And we began by kind of opening up to a number of different professionals within the built environment industry. How can we build trust with the communities that we impact? And we asked a sort of a fairly broad selection of people, and we got typically quite a broad selection of answers. But one thing was that everyone acknowledged that it's really important to build that trust, and you really need to build it and maintain it, and it requires. There's a lot of consistency. It requires consistency, hard work, and something to be maintained and have continuity, and that it is reciprocal, and it needs to be earned. And there was a kind of acknowledgement for everyone that probably the professions around this need to open themselves up and take a bit more risk in engaging with people. And this illustration here by Cheryl Taylor sort of sort of imagines it as a kind of almost like an urban assault course of finding a path through quite a difficult range of issues to progress towards a goal. And Tom Goodhall from Argent summed it up when he said, it's hard earned and easily lost. So you'll see there a number of people that we spoke to. Actually, Angela Coach from Imagine Spaces, I think, is speaking as part of Design Week. She's interested in the way that 3D modelling and engaging people with that is a way to move things forward, and we've certainly seen that. And using different ways of communications, whether it's using physical models or the VR headsets that we've used, allows people to engage with things in a different way. Adam Richards from Camden Highline has been really instrumental in engaging with local children around this really interesting idea in Camden about using the former railway lines into King's Cross for a high line in London, not just in New York. And then Kate Ives from Waits Residential, so a development director on the house building side, sort of said it well when she said you really have to get to receive trust. All you have to do is give it unequivocally. So you really do need to open yourself up and put yourself out there. But as Rosie is saying, it's not necessarily an easy process. Quite often the projects you're doing require major upheaval to neighbourhoods or areas that people already have some kind of affinity for. And Anna Shapiro in our office did this rather nice illustration to point out this fact that, for example, take the issue of skateboarding. People who use skateboarding are using the city or reinventing urban environments which might otherwise be a little bit forlorn, and repurposing them and using the spaces in a different way. However, some people might also find those sort of uses to be antisocial or negative in some way. And Ian Borden, who's Professor of Architecture at Bartlett, but also a keen skateboarder, sort of really picked up on that point, and the point about cities being places where there needs to be something for everyone, and the trick of design is to create places that can be put to a number of different purposes and mean something to different cohorts within society. And then I had one of the articles in the publication is a discussion I had between myself and Martin Evans, who's a development director at UNI in London. So UNI, along with perhaps one or two others in the UK, are probably the sort of most forward-thinking developers in the UK, and they're working in London, across the southeast, but they're also picking up a major scheme in which is Mayfield in Manchester. And Martin's actually quite outspoken and quite honest about the fact that he says developers are pretty appalling at giving architects a good brief, and architects are quite appalling at asking for it. And regeneration, particularly, which is what he's involved in, I'm involved with quite a lot, tends to be something that's done to people, not with them or for them enough. And we really need to find a common language and a means of generating a meaningful dialogue and communication. But he was fairly upfront about the fact that acting as a developer is a risky business. The ability to deliver projects is fraught with financial risk, and at the same time their job is to deliver some kind of return to their investors. So he's saying there's a real conflict there, and we need to kind of confront that more honestly. And on the scheme in Mayfield, they, unlike most of the other bidders looking to acquire a major city centre site, they sought to retain as much of the existing structure, much of it which is fairly redundant industrial sort of heritage stuff, but nothing particular necessarily of heritage value, but of social value and something that people can remember. There's a watercourse that runs through the site that people in Manchester remember and relate to. And so they took the riskier path of seeking to retain as many buildings, as much of that infrastructure as possible, and build in and around it, which he acknowledges is a riskier and more expensive approach, takes longer, there's more unknowns. But they're taking the position that keeping those things gives them something to build the place around and grow the place around, and that they'll have more value and more longevity in the long run. So that sort of chimes with a project that we've been working with in Poplar in East London. This is Crisp Street Market, which was one of the earliest pedestrianised little shopping malls in the UK. It was built in the East End in the post-war era, and actually some of the buildings now are sort of heritage assets from the 1950s. Much of this area was bombed during the war, and our client there was Poplar Harker, who are the local RSL, so the local social landlord that looks after all of the social housing in that district, and a new housing developer looking to regenerate that area, which has become tired and run down and needs investment. But looking at quite a high density development to recreate a sort of the local centre. So what we learned through this process, and it's sort of applying the learning of this going forward, really, rather than something we instigated at the beginning, was we through the life of the project, we ended up having one of the shop units in the little shopping mall there, with Poplar Harker as a kind of a live exhibition of our evolving proposals. So we had the models, we had some of the drawings down there. There was people in there every day, and we got into the habit of going down there and having our meetings down there. And we actually started to get to know the market traders in the square, and we got to know about the events that were going on, and we got to know people a little bit better, and we were able to engage and communicate with them our ideas and build that trust. So whilst there's some a lot of the buildings down there are past their useful design life. There's some heritage assets as part of the 1950s buildings that we kept. There's a clock tower that was built then, but equally there's the David Adjaye designed the idea store, one of the first idea stores down there, and that actually has become a real anchor for the community because it has an incredibly high footfall of people going through there. And once we learned about that and started to understand that was a real key part of the community, it's one of the deprived areas of Tower Hamlets. We decided to build on that. So our new proposal actually looks to expand on that building to provide a meeting room and an event space up at the top that's flexible, that can host a wedding, and then business startup space on the first and second floor and a cafe on the ground floor. And there's a cinema embedded in there as well as part of that, and a complete repurposing of the market square with a new canopy with a more open and more public realm. To provide a platform for this community, which will also absorb, quite high density of new residential blocks of mixed tenure across the scheme. But us having a presence on the site actually gave us a little bit more of a sort of a granular knowledge and local knowledge. And whilst the scheme was not without its controversy, at least we were alive to the issues and we were able to address them, and ultimately we achieved a successful planning consent, which we're still working towards implementing, hopefully in the future. One of the other projects that, and this is a bit more topical, and it doesn't feature so much in the book necessarily, but has been one of the interesting things that's sort of come out of this process, is a live project that we're currently working on for Eastwick and Sweetwater, which is part of the Olympic Park, the much wider master plan for the regeneration of the Lee Valley. And we are master planning a whole part of the park along the Hackney Wick side of the park, and this is just one of the plots that we are designing alongside other architects. And what's interesting about this is another major regeneration scheme, is that some of the placemaking initiatives are already starting to happen a little bit upstream of the development happening. So we got involved in designing this footbridge, which links across to Hackney Wick, which is a former industrial area, and now sort of an artistic community, which is itself being sort of regenerated, and new buildings coming in here and making these connections across the canal, so that kids from that area can get across to a school that's within the Olympic Park. Is really key part of the master plan, what we're trying to achieve. And then what's also interesting is along the Lee Valley, where our master plan is situated, along the banks of the canal there, there was already this idea to sort of energize the waterfront environment. And Barge East, for example, which is actually a barge underneath that white tent at the back there, floating on the canal, has a really quite a good restaurant. Interestingly, through the lockdown and through the summer, they fast forwarded on sort of taking over the banks of the riverside and creating an outdoor dining area that has been really successful throughout the summer. So, and this is all part of a kind of a strategy to kind of grow the place before you build the buildings, and implant the idea of what the place is like in people's minds before the physical artifacts of the buildings come along later. Another aspect we've been drawing on is Opening Doors and Opening Minds initiative, and this is looking to increase diversity and bring the idea of architecture and design, engaging with school children, to bring that in. And a separate part alongside that, on the East Wick and Sweetwater project, we actually engaged with the Mossbourne Academy, who have, in their sixth form, they've created an architecture club. These kids are quite lucky in that they go to a school that was designed by Richard Rogers about 10 years ago, but again, which replaced one of the sort of failing schools in one of the most deprived areas of Hackney, although the school now is actually a very diverse group. There's actually still some very deprived areas around there, but Hackney is changing fast, so it's some quite affluent kids in there as well. So we had the kids into our office for a day whilst we were kicking off on the design phase of this, and just got them involved in joining in the process that we're doing. And we gave them there's a row of townhouses that are part of our plot, and we asked them to join in with us and sketch around some ideas, and we did a bit of a pin-up, and we ended up pinning up a kind of this sort of mad terrace of mad ideas for townhouses. But what was interesting was really that it made us realise that actually, as architects, we're really good. We've learned, our 6 years of college and studying wasn't for nothing. We are really good at being able to synthesize different requirements. And when you ask some 16-year-olds to balance the idea of privacy, openness, environmental materials, what sort of proportions things should have, you get some quite strange responses as well as some quite interesting ones. What was interesting was we asked a direct question about design and this, but that was actually a little bit of a decoy. What we really wanted to do was to just talk to the kids about design and what was important to them in this, because it's their part of London. So this was a kind of a consultation experiment by stealth, really. And so by getting them to talk about design, we got them to talk about the notion of what their home and their environment was like. And one of the things they were all interested in was the idea of creating a peaceful, secure environment. They were concerned to screen out noise. They wanted calmness. None of them got excited about the idea of designing a house or this area as a kind of a place of a party or something like that. Or they wanted somewhere to be quiet and hang out with their friends. That was the implicit message. We asked a direct question, but we weren't really looking for that answer. So that reinforced when we came to the design. that we've developed, which is mainly large apartment blocks but mixed tenure, creating at the heart of our block a really secure, shared communal space. They all got very enthusiastic, talking about places where they could sort of meet their friends and not feel that they would be jeopardizing themselves or in the wrong place at the wrong time, and people wouldn't permit them to be there, or they'd be pushed out. So it sort of reinforced the sort of notion we already had that the central space should be a sort of communal garden. A lot of the kids that we were talking to lived in apartments and didn't necessarily have a private garden, so it wasn't something that they missed. The townhouses we designed did have small private yards and roof terraces as part of it, but it's sort of that exercise was really interesting just to see how they react. And when we talked about design, and then I wouldn't say the ideas necessarily directly filtered in, but there was more the sort of sense of wanting to create, focusing our minds on the kind of environment that people wanted to create. And when we talked to them about should design be traditional or modern, they're actually very open-minded in that they love the some of the warehouse buildings around the park, but they love the Pringle, as it's called, which is the velodrome, and they were really very interested in contemporary design and why can't buildings look like iPhones and that kind of thing. So that was really interesting to us as well. So this is the scheme as it's emerging, and one of the little things, and the next slide shows the townhouses. And whilst our brief was to create a uniform terrace with two different house types within that, we took that idea of individualization of each of the houses, so that each front porch would have a tile design done by a local artist, which would make each house have its own little unique piece as part of it. And that was something that came out of that discussion. So these are our sort of faltering steps into trying to engage more directly or engage in a different way and trying to feed that in. And it's not just on the bigger regeneration projects, the higher density things. We've been involved in doing sort of mid-rise apartment blocks in Camden, but also lower density housing developments in Barking Riverside and in Harlow, Newhall along the bottom, where we've been building housing estates essentially, or new urban areas. And this is one where, interesting, that idea of taste, there's sort of an idea out there, and I think this is what makes architects sometimes nervous, is that there's this idea that people prefer traditional design. I don't believe that at all. I think people respond to good design. And when we took on the Barking project, we were working with one of the big national house builders, and they were quite nervous that we were pushing things in quite a kind of contemporary design direction. But once it was built, what was interesting was that it turned out to be one of the, well, it won us some design awards in terms of urban design, so we were very happy. It was because we'd managed to achieve something that we felt very positive about. But perhaps more importantly, well, important for the client was this was one of the most successful developments. It sold, at the time, it was selling better or as fast as any of their other more traditional looking developments. So that idea that public taste, you can't really engage with it, I think is a bit of a falsehood. And I think actually when you look at initiatives like, or things like Grand Designs and the popularity of all of those sort of TV shows that actually start to talk about design culture, people are actually much more receptive to forward-looking design than they're perhaps given credit for. And I met someone a few weeks ago who turned out their daughter lives in one of these houses, and they were saying to me how the things they were happy about and the things that they weren't, and the things they weren't happy about were the way we designed the bin stores. So we'll remember that one for next time. That was the interesting point about that one. And I'll hand back to Rosie, the next bit.
Yeah, so like Dan was saying before, I think especially with the the example of the Mossborn Academy engagement session, I think often, and this gets back to the trust section as well, and the idea that you have to give trust to receive it, and you have to trust that the engagement and the feedback that you're going to get is going to be good quality. And I think especially with engaging with young people and engaging with children potentially, the dominant narrative for youth and architecture or youth and regeneration, it doesn't depict young people really as stakeholders of value in this process. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Often young people are sort of seen as a nuisance, or they don't take these things seriously, or in public spaces, young people are even seen as a security risk. So, this next example is of a project that was recently completed, and it really contests that narrative, and it really epitomizes some of the principles of co-creation in action. And this was an example of where the end users are really empowered to be decision makers through a process of co-creation, and they were also young people. So this is Manchester's Contact Theatre, and this project actually completed in July this year. So Contact Theatre, it's a youth-focused theatre, and their work is informed by a history of youth governance with young people under the age of 25, not only on the board of trustees, but they're also involved in staff appointments and artistic programming. And that methodology is actually applied to everything that they do, and that included the theatre redevelopment. So Contact have built this history of youth governance, and they actually developed new processes of youth governance for this redevelopment project, and that was through a youth consultant group that they created, and it was called Construct. And so this was really to ensure that the designs for the theatre reflected the needs of its members, of its staff, and of its audience. So we spoke with Sheppard Robson architect Jasmine Eastwood, as well as Contact director Matt Fenton and Jake Howarth, who is a member of Construct, this consultation team. So one important thing to understand about this process was that Construct wasn't just random young people or the audience who were saying what they wanted to happen with the redevelopment. Construct was made up of young people who were really embedded in the theater and understood its ethos. They had a really thorough understanding and really a love for this theater. It was a group that was created specifically to facilitate the decision-making process within the redevelopment. So it was a dedicated group of young people. They were chosen from across the theater's programs to see the new building through from really its inception through to its completion. And they started really early in the process. They even ran the interview process for appointing the designer, so appointing Sheppard Robson. And this was done in a way that's really not typical of other projects. But what happened was the designers were immediately engaged with the end users, and it really reinforced their needs from the very beginning of the project. So Jasmine noted that during this process, she was really struck by Construct's willingness to get stuck into the project and to make hard decisions. And this was something that often the capital team would struggle with due to conflicting opinions. When there were times that losing the big picture really for the project, Construct were the ones who were really good at honing it back to basics and what they were really trying to do with the project. So the key to this was establishing 4 main principles early on that then became the DNA of the project. So those principles were sustainability, improved access in the building, financial viability, and creating new creative spaces. So these principles then, they would use to refer back to when they were deciding on major elements to retain and what to remove. And this list of aspirations was really one of the most useful tools in the project. It really constantly reinforced, and they were able to revisit what they wanted to do with this. And it offered a benchmark really for the project to make sure that they stayed true to the key visions and the project aims throughout challenges that inevitably arose during the project. An example of this would be during the process, it was found that the lift in the building wasn't really in a good position for wheelchair users. and it really needed to be moved or reoriented. And while this is something that through value engineering, a cost consultant might say that the lift replacement would be easy to remove from the redesign, Construct were very adamant to keep it because it was a key aspiration. So they had to find other ways to value engineer and find things that weren't part of those key aspirations, so that in the end, their needs were really met. So in this case, having a voice that actually represented the core group of end users was really key to staying true to the vision of the theater. Jasmine also noted that Construct's understanding of the practicalities of the project were really underestimated at the beginning, as was how much they would want to be involved. It's also important to acknowledge that Contact already has this really long history of youth governance. So it was, in a sense, less of a leap for them to do a project in this way, whereas it might be more of a leap or a challenge or even a risk for an organization that doesn't already have that in place. But that being said, there are key lessons that can be applied from this project to other projects. Again, this really gets back to what Dan was saying before. It's all about establishing trust. If there's no trust, it's not going to work. But at Contact, there was already this overarching feeling of trust. The people that work at Contact, they feel like they have a voice that's reinforced every day at the theater. But in a different context, where that high level of trust hasn't been established, you really need to begin with that first to be able to cultivate engagement. So one suggestion from this project was really creating quick win decisions early on in a project. This allows participants to see that they made a decision early on and that it was acted on, and that builds trust early on so that when there is conflict later on in the project, you already have that foundation of trust built. It's also important to consider who the people are that you need to involve and what they need in order to engage. So you need to consider that, at Contact, this was students. There were a lot of students. There were people that worked full time, and the engagement sessions needed to be tailored to fit their needs. So they were actually held in the evenings, whereas some engagement processes might normally be held during the day, during architects' working hours. But when you do that, you really leave out a lot of people that would otherwise want to be involved, and you end up with a really limited set of voices. So really, consultation needs to be scheduled around the availability of participants, and you need to really consider ways to meet their needs, how and where you meet, or even things like childcare. Otherwise, people really won't be able to participate. What's key is really that there are end users in the room when conversations are being had, so that they're part of the discussions about what can be changed and what can be value engineered, because they will have different opinions and they deserve to be heard. And really, the result of this process just reinforces the idea that all citizens have a really valuable contribution to make, and that the consultation process needs to be interrogated and it needs to be restructured to reflect that.
So looking forward then, through this process, we acknowledge this idea of trying to make co-creation a thing is actually quite an idealistic idea, and there's a lot of barriers against making this. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's something that's going to take time to take root, but it is something that's in the ether. There's some interesting new ways of the way that local authorities are starting to take on developments themselves. And I know some interesting scheme I saw recently starting to happen in York around that idea. But what we did at the end of the process is in the publication, we've set out a few of the sort of key principles that we've sort of felt that we've learned through this process, which we're going to seek to try and develop further, or at least provides a sort of a basis for further discussion. So and so those principles are really around generating honest feedback and opening up the process to allow people to actually confront. Sometimes there's an elephant in the room that needs to be talked about, and that is the basis of building good trust and maybe sort of heal some of the tensions that might exist, and then move forward a little bit more productively. And then enabling genuine participation is obviously really critical to that. And as Rosie was just explaining, allow people, the agency, to actually contribute in the right way. Going on. And then I think this is one of the most important ones, was the aspect of time, and this is perhaps where the biggest barrier is that the earlier in the process that you can involve people, the more latitude there is to sort of take on board suggestions. But that's something that often at the outset of the project is where there's the most risk for the stakeholders or the owners, and so their natural propensity is to not invest too much up front in terms of time as well. People want to move forward with projects as quickly as possible, and it needs to be a continuous process. And then the other thing is, and I think this is something that's incumbent for architects, is to really understand the wider development context, not just in terms of the physicality of where you might be designing or the area you're designing for, but the community and the politics of what you're doing, and what are the needs of the wider society needs, and the agenda. And the slide there showing project we've done for a new civic centre at Hounslow in London, and the purpose of the project there is actually to consolidate all of the council functions into one much more efficient, modern, sustainable civic centre building. But what that does is it co-locates a whole number of disparate functions within the council into one building, and in so doing releases another large site for redevelopment, which will be for housing and homes, and will bring something much needed in the wider needs of the borough. So that being for architects, the ability to go downstream and sort of talk to the actual users, but to go upstream and talk to the people that are making policies in the local area, forging the development plan or the for the next 10 years, to be able to engage and deal at that level as well. So it's that's really important, I think, for architects in particular. And then finally, the sustainable agenda is something that in our practice we care deeply about. We've invested a lot in the last 15-20 years, and it was in the ethos coming out of the post-war era of our practice was built on rebuilding in a credible way, and it's still something that we're really interested in now, and we're really keen to practice what we preach and put forward that message. And the image on the right is a recent scheme we got consent for in the City of London. It's for a hotel, but it's actually got some mixed use elements as part of it. And actually the head of planning in the city said to me, he said, I've seen this pavilion you guys have built, the Hardman Pavilion in Manchester, which is a timber frame building with green facades. And he said, you're doing something really interesting in Manchester. Why can't we have something like that in the City of London? And here we had a very sensitive site with a great one listed church next door to it. And so that actually unlocked the idea of doing something differently and thinking about the way buildings could be differently. We ended up doing this mega living wall facade, which would be the largest in Europe. If it's, I'm sure somebody build a bigger one as soon as we say that. But that kind of dialogue made us change the way we were thinking about the design, started to take things in a more interesting direction. And it was through that dialogue between ourselves and the chief planner in the city that actually we're actually able to unlock something that looks pretty remarkable that you wouldn't normally expect in a kind of a sensitive area of the City of London, to do something quite different. And that came out of this idea of creating dialogue. So we do believe that this idea of co-creation creates a way forward for architecture, and it's this idea that architects need to be adaptable and agile to respond to their role within society. Just because we've done things a certain way doesn't mean we shouldn't do things differently going forward. And maybe the role of the architect is more one of advocacy, and not just us sitting in our offices designing buildings and getting super focused on that. That's a big part of it. It's a key part of it, but we need to move beyond that and be the conductor, be the MC, if you like, of the design team, and be much more proactive in going both upstream, talking about big policy issues, as well as being prepared to get down to the granular detail and meet people and engage with people in the places where we're working, as a way of meeting those needs of the sort of sustainable development, which I think we're all interested in. So that's it. Thanks very much, everyone. Rosie, is there anything else to add?
Yeah, just that the full publication is available to download on our website, sheppardrobson.com. We are also doing a limited print run in the interest of sustainability. But if you do want a printed copy, just send me an email and I can secure one for you when we go to print. But that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. That was really, really great. Shall we stop sharing now and then we can open up to questions if anyone's got anything burning? I mean, I've written down so much stuff, but I think maybe because I'll talk forever, or we will probably talk forever if we don't open it out. So does anyone have anything they want to ask? If you want to just raise your hand on there, I can't remember, it's on the bottom somewhere, reactions. Or you can just do an emoji. Or write in the chat box if you have anything that you wanted to.
I think I like that. There's a comment there about what does value engineering mean?
Yeah, we could go with that. Do you want to go with that?
And I think that's quite an interesting one because it's that's if there ever there was a bit of built environment jargon, value engineering would be one of them, and a rather well-known architect who I won't name said recently it's got nothing to do with value and all to do with engineering, and I mean in general it's a kind of can be code for just making things cheaper, but I think as architects we actually that there if you take the kind of cliche of it aside, we should be able to come up with balanced and refined judgments about what value means, and it doesn't just mean financial value, it means value to the project. And when you actually start looking about the embodied carbon on a project or the life cycle of the whole building, then value engineering starts to take on a bit of a different meaning from its usual connotation, which just means trying to make things cheaper. Well, not to say that obviously building to a budget is always a challenge that you as an architect you have to deal with, and rightly so.
Yeah, I think the context that I used it in was talking about contact, and in that case they were working to a limited budget, and that was where those key principles really came in. So anything that hit those key principles was not going to be value engineered out of that. So there was another way that they needed to meet the budget. They had to find something that wasn't part of those key principles, so that in the end they met the budget, but they also met all their aspirations for the brief.
I think what I was going to say as well about the keeping trust once you've managed to gain it after all the hard work that you've done within the brief and the design process, and then getting to a point where you might need to value engineer it, and then that can be the moment, I guess, when the trust can get lost, because you've sort of got to the point where can't actually deliver on all of these amazing ideas and
yeah, that's an interesting one, because I think quite often as architects, it's quite easy to, and this again, maybe value engineering is relevant. It's quite easy to kind of believe, sell the dream and create the images that look really great, and there's a tendency, or there can be a tendency, to kind of ignore how you would implement that idea, because you want to communicate the vision that you have. And obviously the risk you take with that is, if you can't deliver on your promise later, when you get into the nitty gritty and you need to deal with the functional aspects of it, you can quite easily lose some of those key parts of your design, and you do lose trust. And one of the things that I'm interested in our practice, and I've always been interested in, is how you actually craft buildings, and the importance, design doesn't stop when you submit the planning application. It goes right the way through the process. And if you're doing it right, and we believe this is in the practice, that we don't want to be the concept architects who hand over our genius design to somebody else to go and build out. We want to build what we design, and we want to see it through, and we want to craft buildings and see it through. So that's part of our ethos. So we try not to over promise or pull the wool over everyone's eyes about what we're actually hoping to do, and we try and make sure that we design thoroughly, so that we're not having to reverse out of something that we've promised everyone. And that is very important in building your reputation, not just on this project. It's the next project that keeps your practice alive and kicking. So yeah, I think that's the key thing there, is you need to balance the practical requirements as well as the vision.
So there's a few more questions on here. Any plans for carbon neutral buildings or passive houses? Do you want to go into
yeah, I mean, we did a project almost 10 years ago now, which was a project called the Lighthouse at BRE in Watford, where we built a prototype zero carbon house site using all timber frame construction, or timber and SIPS panels actually, and it was tested in situ for a year or so, and that actually was the precursor to us getting involved in the Barking project that I showed briefly. And that was built, that house prototype was built around the idea of passive house, plus with all the sustainable things into it. So it is something that we're really passionate about. We've invested a lot in looking at sustainable housing, so we're dying to do some more of it. At the moment, we're not doing. We're looking at one or two more developments in terms of the low density stuff. At the moment, most of our work is, certainly in London, is around the high density regeneration projects, as you might expect. But it is an interesting part of our portfolio, and we are looking to do more of it. Yeah.
So Charlotte asks, I guess there's a stage of decision making that happens before the architect is commissioned about which areas need developing or how much budget is directed into developments. Do you think the architecture industry has a role to play in advocating for the people who use a space before a brief is totally crystallised?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what I was sort of saying about architects need to go upstream a little bit more. I mean, there's the new white paper for the on planning that the government has put out to consultation, and everyone understands that the planning industry in this country needs an overhaul. One of the things that came out of this initiative that we've been involved with was, and the upstream thinking is, too often the tensions that have built up around development are played out through one project, the project that you happen to be working on, when what people quite often, when you're in a consultation meeting, what people are quite upset about is that they don't understand, or they don't feel implicated in the policies that sit behind what we're being asked to do. So quite often in a consultation meeting, people might be quite upset about whatever it is, but they don't realise that that's actually part of the local development plan. Says that we're going to, the planning policy says we want to redevelop this area to create much needed housing. And that's one of the things where I think actually co-creation could be of most value, is if people had more opportunity to input into the policies that affect their areas, not just the projects as they come forward one by one. If people could agree that, okay, we need to create housing in this area, where are the best places for it? What else needs to happen to facilitate that? What kind of place do we want to create? Putting that in the framework of the policy would mean those debates might happen before the design team is appointed for a particular project, and some of those discussions have already taken place because they would be enshrined in policy. And that's what I mean when I think architects need to be advocates of trying to set those agendas set the agenda and have a discussion for a whole town or a borough, and bring that forward. And again, it's also where education comes in. So one of the great things about the Mossbourne Academy, setting up an architecture club and getting those kids to come out and meet with us and go to Richard Rogers' office and all that, is educating people about architecture, design culture, city making, because it's not anywhere on the curriculum. So no wonder people struggle to engage with it, because people just don't learn about it. And I think that's a key message I get across, is we really need to start teaching urban design, or at least some basis of it, and getting people interested in design culture when they're still at school, not when they've chosen to become an architect.
Yeah, it's my friend Emma was put out a tweet yesterday about why do we don't teach politics or urban design or anything at a young age at school. It's like you don't even know that you can have an influence or have a say in these issues. So Laura asks, how do you explain the importance and value of design quality, and usually the perception of higher costs to stakeholders who are more concerned with the budget and numbers or time, and don't appreciate design or even appreciate the need for it?
That's If I had a magic formula for that one, I'd be a lot more successful than we are. But I sat in a meeting this morning where for a big office building that we're starting to look at, and the discussion was, we've got a particularly complicated structural foundation issue, which is, and we want to do a kind of a express steel structure. And the developer involved sort of was asking how much more it was going to cost to do this more adventurous design solution. And so there's a discussion around that. But then interestingly, one of the other guys said it for me. He said, well, to the guys looking at what the value of this potential building would be, well, they're saying, well, this building is going to look really striking, isn't it? Presumably, if it looks the way it does, we'll be able to make this more of a signature building, and we'll be able to get a better rent for it, won't we? And that actually shows the balancing act that the clients are often making. So how much is it going to cost me to build this? What is the financial value in this case? And they're actually they're seeing the value of the design and attributing a financial value to it. Obviously, us as architects, we need to be valuing not the economic value, but the social value and the environmental value of what we're doing. And the more enlightened clients, the kind of people that are interesting to work with, are taking on board that the buildings we're building need to have some longevity. If they've got longevity, people need to love them. So people will look after them, love them. Therefore, it's important that they look great. It's important that they function, and that they meet the environmental agenda as well. So whilst often you find yourself arguing about the cost of things, I always want to kind of argue the holistic value of what we're doing, because that's the role of the architect, and we shouldn't be kind of, well, sometimes it can be a bit soul destroying when people are sort of picking apart the cost of everything you're drawing. I think it's really important that you hang on to those values and continue to advocate for them. You might not win every battle, but it's a battle worth fighting.
Jai, did you want to ask a question? You have your hand up.
Yeah, I did. I'm really interested in co-design in the sense of how do you make sure people are heard, and what are the necessary things you need to have in place to make sure someone feels that their voice is valid and feels that they can be heard? How are people heard and understood successfully? And you talked about finding the elephants in the room and leaving space for the unexpected to come out. I think that's really valid. And what successful ways have you had of exposing elephants and finding the unexpected, and particularly in thinking about inclusivity and how people who feel like they really belong in a place or a community are much more likely to be outspoken and to be that loudest voice in the room? And what ways have you had of leveling that out and bringing out ideas? And so other things I'm thinking is, do people who draw better, do they feel more heard? Do they successfully expressing themselves? What kinds of tools do people need to have in place, and what technologies or what ways of coordinating, like planning meetings, are there that level that out?
That's really thoughtful, and there's a lot there. I can tell you've been thinking about it. Well, I mean, I think I'll try and pick up a few of them. I think one thing, I mean, we were talking before we started with Rebecca that tomorrow I'm doing a consultation event tomorrow, and it's all going to be online. We've done a kind of a walk-in exhibition, but it's with nobody there, so it's that's one thing. So it's the normal public engagement event hasn't taken place, and we're going to do something online. And I was talking to our engagement consultant guy who's organising it, and he was sort of saying, well, actually, this is going to be quite interesting because we've got fewer people participating, but you haven't got the normal people that I would expect to be participating, and you can expect it to be much more reasonable dialogue based on some of the previous experience he's had with doing this. So we've opened up another channel of communication, which is not necessarily perfect and is not necessarily accessible to everyone, but it's certainly opening up another channel to another cohort of people that perhaps in normal circumstances wouldn't have engaged. I mean, obviously we may well be, by doing it this way, excluding another group of people that so I think that the answer is probably around having as multiple methods of communicating with people as possible. One of I was very keen when we had the sixth formers in on Eastwick and Sweetwater that we didn't ask direct questions, because when I was a teenager I didn't like being put on the spot, and by actually sitting beside people, not across the table from them, and drawing them, as I was saying, the kind of the drawing exercise was all a bit of a decoy in the end. We didn't really set out, it wasn't calculated, but it turned out to work that way, because the valuable bits, insights we got out of it were not about sitting there and trying to draw buildings together. It was the conversations we had and learning what their values were and what they were saying, and importantly what they weren't talking about. And so, I would have expected the teenagers to be sort of saying, oh yeah, I want to have my house, I'll have it as a party house with all my mates there and we have music going loud, but they weren't talking about that. They were all really kind of concerned about having somewhere quiet to do their schoolwork and stuff. Maybe we got some of the more focused kids. And then the other thing I would say, in my experience of public consultation thing, is the investment of time. I actually quite enjoy doing those things, even if they're sometimes quite confrontational, because if you just let people talk and talk and talk, eventually they talk themselves out. And if you are prepared as an architect or a professional involved in that to invest the time to and not try and brush people off or get them to fill in a form and go away, but actually just hear them out. Nobody, even people who can be quite angry or upset, can't be angry and upset for too long, or maybe they just go away, and eventually you can start to have a bit of a dialogue, I've learned, and so I found just invest the time to listen to people. Eventually they will start to make reasoned arguments about what they want to say, or you'll get to the bottom of what they're really what their real concerns are. That's just off the cuff, based on, you know, particularly thinking about in public engagement events. In terms of communicating the design, I think it's quite interesting when you show, if as an architect you are prepared to lay open the process and show your sketches and show your thinking and draw in front of a client or draw in front of people, people realise that actually there's a skill set there. And when they try and do it themselves, if they don't have that training, they're often not half as good as they think they're going to be, and they start to see the value of what you're doing. But also by doing that, you're starting to create a dialogue, and you're starting to explain why you made certain decisions. And if you've got a decent design logic, people will be carried along with it, or they'll challenge you and force you to change your idea. Another another good architect said to me when I was a very young architect, he said, a good architect recognises when to junk an idea. If you're a good architect, you're confident that you will have good ideas. So if you've got the wrong idea, you don't mind binning it because you're confident of getting another one. A bad architect has one idea and clings to it for dear life in the face of everything, because he's worried that he's not going to have another one. And I thought that was a good insight at the time. So that's one I try and remember.
Brilliant. Well, we're probably out of time now, and we've got another session at 5 o'clock where you can hear from Matt and Fiona, who do co-creation with children and young people. If you guys haven't booked a ticket and you have time tonight, you're very welcome to join us. So yeah, thank you everyone so much. Thank you to Dan and Rosie. Absolutely brilliant presentation, and thank you so much for your time. I think I might have to order a printed copy.
Yeah, I've sent you an email to order a printed copy. Can I just say that was absolutely amazing. I've learnt so much that I can apply to the sort of MCN group that I'm part of in York. That really opened up the dialogue for one thing. Thank you very much.
That's really great to hear. Thanks everyone. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much.
Really great.